This is episode 146 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Wally, we are having this as the first episode in the wake of local elections across our state, at least those that adopted the new state law to consolidate elections. City of Albuquerque saw, higher turnout, 23%. So that's good, I think, for everybody involved. The issues were a mixed bag. Of course, the Rio Grande Foundation most strenuously opposed the misguided democracy dollars issue, which would have created a $25 voucher system available to anybody with a pulse, apparently, in city of Albuquerque. They would have then been able to use those $25 vouchers paid for by yours truly, the taxpayers, to fund the campaigns of city mayoral and council candidates. And it was not a overwhelming defeat. I guess we beat the mandatory paid sick leave defeat by a little over a percentage point. That was truly a nail biter. But Wally, aside from democracy dollars and any other things you want to add on the races, et cetera, what was your impression of the election recently?
Well, the democracy dollars was the one that I had the highest hopes for, and the fact that went down to defeat, I think, is a bright day for democracy. As you say, misnamed, I think it wasn't. It's bureaucratic, higher taxes dollars. And as we've already seen with the current public funding of campaigns, there's a lot of abuse in that system. And so it doesn't do what it says it's going to do. Democracy dollars were not democracy dollars. And the fact that it was voted down against overwhelming campaign spending for democracy dollars as opposed to against. Now, having said that, who was against it? The Rio Grande Foundation. Who else was against it? We had
the New Mexico Business Coalition.
Yep.
Pat Rogers, the attorney who we had on our podcast. And it wasn't just partisan. Pete Dinelli, who's a very liberal Democrat, opposed it and had some very interesting things to say, I think, about it. And also Jeff Apodaca, who has been involved with Democrats for Democracy and some other groups. So it was pretty nonpartisan. I'm sure that if you looked at the vote totals, Republicans voted overwhelmingly against it. More Democrats supported it, but you don't win a race or defeat a ballot initiative, in this case, in Albuquerque, without having some significant Democrat opposition to democracy dollars. So that's all for the good.
Yes, and then that is a really diverse, powerful group of people who are against it. What they didn't have going for them was the big dollars that the pro side had going for it. And the pro side spent hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Around $600,000.
Yeah, I was going to say I've seen 550 plus. So yes, and when the total's there, I'm sure it'll be up there. As opposed to a minor few thousand informal paid advertising. Now, there was earned media. You and others got out there, op-eds, letters to the editor, talking to the media. So it wasn't like there was nothing going on, but there weren't these big TV buys, radio buys, and mailers that were sent to people saying, vote for this. So I think, the voting public, I think, maybe has gotten a taste of some of the things that happen even with Mayor Keller, and the fact that people say they're in the public system, but then they get private funding, and then these external groups come in and do a lot of things. And this would have just made, I think it would have made a mess of elections in Albuquerque, until it would be voted back down. And I think it was great that it was defeated.
I agree with 100% of all of that. And, I think it kind of reflects where this election was for me. Every election is a mixed bag, especially when you're a pretty hardcore limited government guy. You've got all these bonds with what I think is self-evidently manipulative language very little information on the ballot. And of course, all the bonds were passed overwhelmingly. But, getting back to the whole election, it was a win for the good guys, for sanity. But the fact that it was so close is illustrative of the fact that too many people, I don't think, put a lot of thought into what this proposal had in store. The idea that you're not limiting it to registered voters, American citizens, people above the age of 17, 18, whatever it might be. It's truly mind-boggling that the left has so much money, so much more money than you pick them, what the Koch brothers or Rio Grande Foundation, the Business Coalition, every entity on the right, the business groups, they took a hard pass on this election. So the resources at the state and local levels in New Mexico from the progressive liberal side vastly outstrip anything coming from the right. And yet these are the same people who claim they want to keep big money out of the elections when in reality,
big out-of-state money.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what they're bringing to the process.
Right. So, back to kind of getting down to the issues, I thought it would be unlikely that a bond went down. I was hoping that, maybe the transit bond went down because
that was the one that I've said before. If any would go down, it would be the transit bond.
And it had the lowest levels.
Yeah, it did. It had the lowest. It had the lowest win, but it still was
57%.
Yeah, it was still
something,
pretty handy.
And then the transportation tax also got renewed, and people don't realize that that's a quarter cent on your gross receipts tax, which is real money, and 38% of that is diverted to mass transit. So it's not going to do squat for improving the roads and whatnot. It's all going to be, not all, but 38% of it's going to be dedicated to things like ART. Now, the candidates, certainly Peggy Muller-Aragon is the only reform-minded person on APS school board. She was targeted by the unions. She maintained her seat, so she remains my board commissioner. There's a couple of City of Albuquerque races still in recount process. Brooke Bassan is trying to replace Brad Winter. She won the overall vote total, but did not get above the 50% threshold. Isaac Benton, on the other hand, he won his vote overwhelmingly, but not above 50%. There were a number of candidates in the race. So we'll see. And that's going to happen in early December because, if you recall the sick leave issue, that was defeated in October, but then there was a runoff for mayor in November. But because we shifted the month back, now the main election is in November and the runoff will be in early December, which there's certain challenges and issues associated with having an election in December. It could be tough for people to go door to door, could be some weather issues. Of course, they'll have early voting, so it should be okay. But it is an issue getting so late in the year.
Yeah, absolutely. And that brings up another point with regard to when you have elections and how you have elections relative to the Albuquerque Public Schools. Their bonds passed this time, albeit it was a scaled back proposal from that was defeated. And, I think that it's ironic that they put this special election in last year to try to get this passed, thinking that was the way to get it in there because, they could basically get their supporters to do it. And it went down to defeat, just as handily as all these bond packages passed. I would think if Albuquerque Public Schools, just speculating, would have had the above and beyond package they tried last time on the ballot. This time, it probably would have passed. But the key is we are at it will not raise your taxes level with all these bond issues, but your taxes will not go down either on all of these bond issues, and a lot of money's there. And then the other one.
Well, Wally, let me interrupt you real
please.
Quick because the thing was we could, as an organization, and you talk about the breadth and depth and the funding of the left-wing groups. we would have loved to have taken on some of these bond issues and run a more forward-looking media campaign, social media, earned media, et cetera, against some of these other issues. But we were heavily focused on democracy dollars. Now, you put APS tax hike on the ballot at the same time as democracy dollars, and that further, I'm not trying to give the left a roadmap here, but the fact was we had a clear shot at a single issue on the APS ballot. We didn't even start focusing on Santa Fe until after that was decided in early February, because that was our true focus. Now, of course, Santa Fe, the legislative session went very poorly, but that was kind of to be expected. If they load these ballots up with so many issues, there's so many more left-wing organizations with resources that they can kind of allocate time and go after each of these and keep the information available to the voters at a minimum, whereas the having a clear shot at APS and really kind of limiting our extraneous issue efforts to democracy dollars on this ballot. I don't like the fact that they're spending more money on campaign finance. They upped it from $1 per voter to $1.75 per voter, and they did that overwhelmingly while democracy dollars failed. So it is, from the right, from our perspective, the resource indifference imbalance is incredible. It's striking, and people, I don't think, fully appreciate that until you actually look at some of the information about where this money is coming from and who's spending money in Albuquerque elections. Yeah.
So when the tally comes in Albuquerque, there is extensive reporting required on many of these issues, on things related to Albuquerque. There is statewide, but when that final tally comes out, 600,000 to 1,235.
We kept it below 250, Wally. We're going to have a ethics hearing nonetheless, but our little pittance that we're being alleged is setting up an MFC, a Measure Finance Committee in the city of Albuquerque, is no joke. It's a very complicated, convoluted process. We've got a legal challenge on Santa Fe's very similar law dating back to the soda tax.
Right.
I would love to have had a clear shot at a lawsuit on this one, but lawyers, and especially pro bono ones being what they are inclined to be somewhat conservative on these issues, and they definitely don't want to go after them in New Mexico court either, because nobody outside New Mexico, nobody inside New Mexico, nobody wants, at least on the conservative side, moderate side, wants to deal with New Mexico's lousy courts. So there's a multiple layer issue when you start discussing how these campaigns are financed. And then throw out one more thing, which is Mayor Keller on City of Albuquerque property, and we filed an ethics complaint on this. He specifically was advocating for people to go and vote yes. So as if all of the other forces at play are not pushing people towards just reflexively vote yes. That is yet another one, and I think it's sufficiently outrageous that we have indeed filed the ethics complaint against the mayor for using city resources to advocate on an election issue.
Yes, and my take on that is I think that is appropriate. It's a good thing. It's justified. It's interesting how these ethics commissions, though, when there are violations, have in the not too distant past been largely toothless tigers that have really run away from these issues. So, I'm not, that's not to say that this isn't a good issue, but I'm not holding my breath personally that there will be what is the ethics committee going to do to the mayor? A stern talking to or a severe reprimand? Oh, they might say, maybe in the future, you maybe shouldn't do that. We'll see. Or will they do anything? Will they just totally punt the ball? Say, oh no, we couldn't. It wasn't not clear whether this was ethical violation or not.
It will go just as it always goes, which is the left will talk a great game about how they are sticking up for the little guy, the guy with no money, the guy with limited resources. And in reality, these institutions, these laws, these hoops that you have to jump through are to protect the incumbents, the big money people, and those who are in office. And then you have small time folks who either don't know what they're doing or are just stumbling into these thresholds. The full force and weight of the law will be attempted to be brought down on them. And it will be if you don't have the ability to defend yourself. So it's a very frustrating reality of campaign finance, politics in New Mexico. Of course, we focused on the Albuquerque election because it's such a big deal, but Las Cruces, it is worth mentioning that there was a three-way race for mayor of Las Cruces. The leftist mayor, Miyagishima, was relatively handily reelected. As recently as when Governor Martinez had the majorities in the House and was the governor in 2015, Doña Ana County had moved in a more conservative direction, partially because the left overreached. They passed these buses that everybody knew was a boondoggle and still knows is a boondoggle, and it helped push the electorate to the right. Since then, other political forces at play have wound up solidifying Doña Ana, at least for now, as a progressive stronghold. And so that area being as critical to the state of New Mexico as it is, certainly not a great sign for conservatives that it kind of maintained its progressive grip. But there was bright spots all over the state. There was, it's worth noting that Albuquerque and New Mexico and cities in this state were not the only people having elections. Right up the road in Colorado, the biggest single issue on the ballot anywhere in the entire country, candidate be damned, was on the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, which is the greatest single piece of legislation implemented in this country in the last 100 years. I'll say that. The greatest single taxpayer protection, the economic legislation, certainly the Civil Rights Act and some of those, but I'm talking about state level economic-oriented legislation. It was constitutional amendment. Taxpayer Bill of Rights limits spending strictly in Colorado to inflation and population growth. If you have more than that, you have to send checks back to the constituents. If you want to spend more than that, or if you want to raise taxes, you have to go to the voters. And the citizens in increasingly blue progressive California infiltrated Colorado overwhelmingly rejected efforts to take all that money, 56 to 44-ish. So very good day for that issue. And people in bluish states not being completely brain dead.
Yes, and that Colorado, I was certainly pleased for Colorado that passed. Boy, would it be nice to have something like that in New Mexico where, and we'll talk a little bit about oil and revenue and the fact that how government can go unchecked. And I was just trying to think of the mindset that what would the mindset need to be to say, you know what? I think, yes, no matter what, I should not have the right as a voter to weigh in on new taxes to me. I want to totally abdicate that to elected officials indirectly from myself. It was interesting. Colorado's a relatively liberal state in some ways, in very subtle ways, conservative. Just they do have a pretty diverse business industry up there, a lot of things going on, but the fact that passed is a good sign. And man, wouldn't that be nice in New Mexico? Because we'd be getting a check this year if we had something like that in the land of enchantment.
Just to cite some data that we often use in our research, the Federal Reserve of St. Louis puts out per capita personal income by state for 2018. Per capita, so per person, in Colorado, folks made $58,456. In New Mexico, they earned $41,609.
Yeah.
So you are talking a difference of over $17,000 per person that a Coloradoan makes more than a New Mexican. We are different states. in many ways, but we are not that different from an economic perspective. Colorado is a big oil and gas state as well, although they're not going through the boom times that we are. Just phenomenal how much more prosperous Colorado is, regardless of their blue voting patterns. That Taxpayers' Bill of Rights stops so much government shenanigans, and it would be a dream come true, literally, for that to be done in New Mexico, or quite frankly, any other state in the country that wanted to get out of poverty. They should consider a Taxpayers' Bill of Rights. But we are going to talk about oil. We're moving beyond this wonderful election. And I say that, with some seriousness. It was a victory for the Rio Grande Foundation. 2 major ballot victories in one single calendar year between APS back in February and their major tax increase and Democracy Dollars. Oil, yes. I don't think that we've talked enough about oil production in New Mexico, and we'll make it a short conversation, but they anticipate, the powers that be that track these things, over 300 million barrels a year. That's from Ryan Flynn at the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association. That is a 36% increase in production above 2018, which was in turn a major increase from 2017 and so on, going back really to about 2011 when the party got started. So just the superlatives never cease, Wally, but anything you want to throw at the whole oil production thing, it's a phenomenon.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a New Mexico Oil Conservation Division does a monthly oil and natural gas production report that I've been looking at literally 10 years off and on every few weeks. And yes, and that's my assessment as well over 300 million barrels. If we look back just a few short years, about a decade back to 2009, oil production for then was basically, in 2009, let me get that number up here. This is sliding all over. Basically, 2.5 months of current level production was a year's worth of production just a decade ago. That's putting that in perspective. So we are producing a lot of oil in the Permian Basin, and it's a good thing. It's a good thing for New Mexico. It's a good thing for our country. I dare say it's a good thing for the environment because oil production in the United States is the most environmentally friendly of anywhere in the world when it's done. So it's all good. The price of oil, and all of this is happening without the price being really, really high. It's in the 50s and 60s, which is nothing to sneeze at. But we're not talking. This is not $100 barrel oil like we've seen, and it just keeps chugging along. And as many of those players have down there have said that this will be a big play for 10, 20, 30, 50, 100 years into the future, absent massive technological or regulatory change. And so, yes, here we are again, back to the point. What's New Mexico going to do? How are we going to use this money from a governance point of view? Are we going to restructure taxes? Are we just going to spend it frivolously and not have anything to show so that when the oil genie doesn't produce the magical revenues that it is producing today, we will not have improved our economy? That's kind of the issue where we are right now. We've been here for a number of years, but it looks like it'll continue at least for more years. And it's pretty stunning what they're doing down there in southeast New Mexico.
Yeah, and this is a production-driven boom, not a price-driven boom, as we saw a few years ago. It's just the amount of oil discovered in that Permian Basin area is really remarkable. And you would think now the oil and gas industry has gotten very efficient over the years, including not hiring as many people. That's how you keep costs down, and you drill in $55 or so price ranges. And so with all that, we expect that New Mexico's economy is doing better But the data that we're seeing out of the Bureau of Labor Statistics are really interesting. Comparing New Mexico from September 2018 to September 2019. This is available at errorsoфenchantment.com. So you look at that year-over-year data. Colorado grew 2.2%. Of course, they've been growing very fast prior to that. Arizona, 2.3%. New Mexico, 2.4%. Texas, 2.4%. And Utah, 3% year-over-year growth. So we're right in the middle, and that's a job growth number. So that's great. I think everybody who looks at what's going on in New Mexico agrees this is a once in a statehood opportunity for the state of New Mexico. And these other states surrounding us are just doing that on a regular basis. Now, we're all operating in the same Trump boom economy that's going very, very well, with Western states outpacing their neighbors in Maine and Ohio and West Virginia and whatnot. So New Mexico's beating those states handily right now, thanks to being in the West and thanks to the oil production. Now, if you look at the same Bureau of Labor Statistics report for urban areas, they cover 4. None of them are in the oil patch, although Farmington's arguably in it's the natural gas patch, but it's not booming like the Permian. Job growth, same period, September 2018 to September 2019. Remember, the state as a whole, 2.4%, right in the sweet spot with our neighbors. Las Cruces, 0.4%.
Right.
Farmington, 0.4%, suffering from the shutdown of the San Juan generating station. Santa Fe, 0.8%. Albuquerque, 1%. So this is not a evenly distributed job and economic growth boom here. Our cities are chugging along in the strongest economy we've seen at least since the Clinton administration, in my opinion. And they're far from, they're lagging far behind the statewide totals as well as the overall totals from these other states. So it's an interesting situation. Of course, we've long talked about how we need to diversify our economy. Progressive cities, 3 out of 4 of these being progressive, Las Cruces, Santa Fe, Albuquerque, are enacting policies that I am quite confident are dampening growth now. Imagine outside of an oil boom, outside of a strong overall economy, where those cities would be.
Well, the way I have looked at this issue for years is it comes down to the 3 major factors, and it's what are the things that drive economic development or hinder it, either way you want to look at it. And the big 3 for me are education, where as a state we are struggling on educational attainment. And people say, well, what does that have to do? It comes down to trained workforce and companies that want to relocate here or invest here. Their employees have school-age children. Much of the time, that's a very important issue. Crime, which is just it's a quality of life issue. It's a cost issue with insurance. It's crime is a huge factor, and we're struggling there. And then the other is business climate. And there's 2 things that I think are important in that, and that's the tax structure and regulation. But in our case, and so let me just say the tax issue, the 800-pound bad gorilla is our gross receipts tax on services that gets layered or pancaked on businesses doing business services, and it makes it very difficult. And then regulation, I don't know, we're not the best, we're not the worst, but I do think in this kind of tax and regulation, we've talked, and I know in the podcast in about a week, there was that we have, I just heard recorded, helped produce, that there's this whole thing about this progressive mindset that's taken hold in Santa Fe. And so if you're looking at relocating a business, expanding a business in New Mexico in these areas of business climate, it's not just what's there today. It's what you might expect reasonably to be enacted over the next 1, 2, 5, or 10 years. And those, I think, are the drag factors on economic development. And so, what's interesting is Tipping Point, New Mexico's talked about all of those in one way, shape or form. They're all important. We in New Mexico love to talk about our climate, and it's fantastic. We like to talk about our outdoor activities, and they are fantastic. But at the end of the day, from an economic development point of view, I don't think it's been proven they can't carry the day. Because let's face it, there are plenty of other places in the world. In the Caribbean, there's small islands and countries that have spectacular weather, are spectacular outdoor destinations, but they suffer education, crime, and business climate, and they're unable to grow and build diverse economies as well. So these are very important issues that we now have the money to address some of them, but is money the issue? You know, sometimes it's political will. It's what would you say, philosophic approach to things, and certain things with regard to like education and crime. What we're doing is not necessarily been highly effective. Are there going to be reforms, or are we going to actually take it to the other way? Things that sound good, that might be politically popular, that actually make it worse.
Yeah. Well, Colorado is beautiful. Utah is beautiful. Arizona has its beauty. I'm not a big fan of 125 degrees.
It's beautiful if you make it a little further north from Phoenix.
There's places in Arizona to defend Arizona that are not 125 degrees. You know, Flagstaff is lovely, and there's other places around, and people do have air conditioning, and they're moving to Arizona as well, with not a drop, nary a drop of oil in Arizona. And speaking of policy failures at an urban government level, also speaking of being nonpartisan and criticizing someone, i.e. R.J. Berry, who foisted upon the city of Albuquerque, I really can't recall. We recently kind of poked fun at, well, are people going to be flying out of the spaceport, or are they going to be riding the ART buses? Burst.
It's a horse race. It has been for years.
It looks like the ART is going to win by a flat tire, maybe. Something bad that's not particularly useful to going anywhere, just like the ART buses. Mayor Keller has said that he will have that running down the streets of Central and other adjacent boulevards by November the 30th. So just in time for Christmas shopping there, Wally, if you're going downtown, maybe some places in Nob Hill. But November the 30th. Well, it's finally going to be there.
Yes. I don't have a good feeling about this. I really don't. I know this is a podcast, so I should use my words and articulate what I think is going to go wrong better.
I have a feeling there's going to be crashes and pedestrians
lawsuits, and it's confusing, and yes, and not many people will ride it, just like the Rail Runner. And guess what? We have these articulated buses that have come from other transit initiatives, largely funded initially by the federal government by the buses. They tend to have those wrappers, the marketing wrappers, so you can't see what's in them. Look in the windshields of those buses. They're driving these huge buses, driving around with two people in them. So, yes, will this work? I don't know, but we get to see the illogical conclusion of this path. That, as you well point out, this was not a progressive Democrat who proposed and was at the helm of the city of Albuquerque when this was put forward.
Yeah, and just to be clear on the history, Rio Grande Foundation was probably the very first organization in New Mexico to really raise the warning bells on the ART system. Of course, Mayor Berry was not to be deterred. He got the system built and put into place. However, the electric buses, kind of during that transition period between Berry and Keller, now were 2 years ago, where Keller came in and said, there had already been some delays, but that's kind of usual with a lot of these projects. And Keller basically came into office and said, guys, these electric buses do not work. So then they had to go back to the drawing board. We're now going to be running under diesel buses, which is 100-year-old technology practically. The unique feature of the ART is that, well, it's destroyed a lot of good walkable business areas along Central and
good drivable business areas
Exactly.
down to one lane. So
it's made that difficult, and it's also geared towards picking up people in the middle of Central, and that's going to create some of the challenges. So when we're talking about people getting hit, there's bus-only lanes that make it very difficult to drive down Central and make a turn left-handed, or heaven forbid, a U-turn. People catching the buses are in peril. And of course, we've seen complaints from folks along Lead and Cole, the other prominent, effective routes to get up and down, east to west, along the path otherwise served by Central, which has become undrivable for many. So it's pushed that traffic onto Lead and Cole instead. Now, this has been a classic case of poor government management. And yet, of course, getting back to the election, voters approved the quarter-cent tax renewal on transit, 38% of which is transit, and a bond that is largely going to be dedicated to mass transit, despite the fact that with all this investment, now ART is not going yet, but they've expanded transit in recent years. Buses did not go up and down, the articulated buses did not go up and down Coors Boulevard over by my house. That's a recent development, yet transit ridership continues to plummet, whether it's cheap gas, whether it's Uber and Lyft and ride shares. People just don't like mass transit. The famous Onion, the Onion, before the Babylon Bee came in and was really awesome, whereas the Onion was good. But they said there was a headline for an Onion piece, I believe it was 99% of Americans support mass transit for other people.
Exactly. Yes, and this is something that in business and in politics, you really do see is that if you're doing market research on something, people will say that they want something because they feel like it's the right thing to say. They feel uncomfortable saying the other. Are you for this? Absolutely. If you put in this mass transit system, I will ride it. But then when it comes time to ride it, they're like, yeah, this car is awfully convenient and it sure does save me time. And I don't like to walk on a windy, cold afternoon in New Mexico when it's 20 degrees out and the wind's blowing 30 miles an hour. I don't want to have to walk that half a mile from the bus stop. I'll just take my car.
All right. And finally, we will wrap up this podcast. Wally, have you been to a New Mexico United game yet, the soccer team?
No, I have not. I was scheduled to go to one and I had to cancel it. That is a great shortcoming on my part. It sounds like the crowds are really into it. They're having a lot of fun, had quite a bit of success.
Yeah. And,
but I have not been. How about you?
I have not. I've been to Major League Soccer games in the past. I've even been to some international matches when I spent time in Argentina. To talk about a raucous crowd.
Yes.
Go to Argentina and watch some soccer. But, tickets were tough to come by. A lot of people really supporting that team. I have small children, wasn't quite ready to bring the 9, the 7, and the 3-year-old out to a United match. It's a little intense, I think, maybe for them. And, a lot of money for us middle-class, non-wealthy liberals out here to afford United tickets for them. But we're not just idly chatting about the New Mexico United. They are now said to be going to the legislature with some kind of proposal during the 2020 session to ask for presumably some significant taxpayer financing for a brand spanking new specific soccer stadium to be built in Albuquerque.
Unprecedented in the United States. No, it's not. It's par for the course. This happens all the time. Isotope Stadium was rebuilt. There have been in the NFL and Major League Baseball, the amount of taxpayer money that's been spent over the past couple of decades building and renewing stadiums is crazy. And New Mexico United just trying to get in on the action. It's a dangerous thing. I don't think it's a positive thing in general, I can certainly see why they're doing it. And I would have a feeling that they're probably going to get some funding for that.
Their timing is
impeccable.
Very nice.
Yes. So the money is there. The product is good. People really like it. And it's one of those things. Yeah, that it is interesting how what seems to be good public policy in the rich times when the money's flowing in doesn't necessarily seem to be good public policy when it's bad. I have a feeling it's what's good is good, whether the money's there or not. But in this case, I think their timing is real good, and it will be interesting to hear what the arguments supporting it are, in terms of this, because we have an anti-donation clause in the state of New Mexico where you can't fund something specifically for a private entity. Having said that, that thing is a piece of Swiss cheese, and so there are many ways that you can get around those public funds going into there. And I don't know. Have you? This just came out, so I'd be interested to see what the Rio Grande Foundation kind of, if you guys do a commentary or position paper, see what it is. But I would think that in today's, let's spend money on something, we have a lot of it to do. I would think they would stand a pretty good chance of maybe getting some money out of Santa Fe.
I have no doubt that they will get some money. The number of privately construction, this is actually the first political campaign I engaged in my entire life was on a stadium issue back in Ohio. It was a referendum campaign. It was quite an experience, but I suspect that some money will be made available. The question, of course, is how much and for what, and how will they manipulate.
How will it be structured? What entity will own this stadium? Will it be the city of Albuquerque? Will it be some special entity that's set up?
Yeah, and I wasn't here when the stadium, the Dukes to Isotopes transition happened. They were smart. I do know from reading about it that there was a discussion at the time about building an entirely new stadium downtown. I think any business owner, including the folks at the New Mexico United, have to be very wary about going downtown with all of the problems and associated issues there, not the least of which is parking. I think one of the smartest things Albuquerque has done is that they have all of their stadiums largely in the same area, so there's one parking kind of area.
You can share parking.
Sharing that parking situation is great. And you don't have, let's face it, you're adjacent to downtown, but you don't have to deal with too many homeless people accosting you and your family as you make your way, whether it's the Lobos football, the Lobos basketball, or the Isotopes. So details will be of paramount interest, but of course, we philosophically oppose, and economists of all political stripes will state for the record very clearly that taxpayer financing of stadium constructions makes no economic sense. Very few of these stadiums do wind up being constructed without taxpayer dollars. I'm not as familiar with the soccer stadium situation, but Big Four sports, you occasionally get an arena that's funded by some private sector owner because you can pair a hockey team and a basketball team, but football stadiums very rarely, baseball stadiums very rarely. You can count them all on approximately one hand, the number of really privately financed stadiums. So I suspect we're talking anywhere from $20 to $30 to $40 million probably as what they'll be looking for, and that's real money even when you're wallowing in the billion-dollar budget surplus that we have. Those politicians have been spending and growing, and if you think they're going to easily hand their money over to a Albuquerque-based professional semi-pro soccer team, or pro, but minor league soccer team, I think it's going to be a very interesting discussion. There's a lot of other pigs at the trough these days for the money, but there's a lot of money to go around.
Well, and as you say, I think the economic policy arguments against it, I think you did a great job of laying that. Now, the one thing that will tend to work against this in raw politics is that the legislators that are not directly in Albuquerque and Bernalillo County bristle at giving anything to Albuquerque and Bernalillo County. So if this thing does go through and does happen, it will be interesting to see what sort of horse trading would be necessary for that to happen, because those rural legislators do not like writing big checks to entities in Albuquerque if they can avoid it.
Justifiably so.
Yes,
And,
no, exactly.
I don't, just off the cuff, I'm thinking,
Does anyone like writing a check for somebody else on
well,
anything?
no, I'm thinking about University of New Mexico has a soccer facility that's no longer being used. As to paraphrase Mark Twain, the death of soccer in New Mexico has been overly reported or highly inflated. So soccer is obviously alive and well, and maybe, I think unprecedentedly so in the land of enchantment. Now, could you get through the bureaucracies to get some land transferred, the soccer facility transferred out of University of New Mexico and put into use by the New Mexico United? I don't know, but it's at least worth having that conversation, because UNM is not using their facility anymore, at least not for men's soccer, maybe I guess women's, but to be continued. We will have more discussions on this down the road. Thanks for listening to this week's podcast. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing the show.